and gentlemen, welcome to one in the series of the School of Law seminars. My name is Jean. I am the director of the Human Rights Centre, but my area of interest is international law, and so I'm very happy to be able to host this session with Dr. Roslyn, who teaches at the National University of Ireland in Maynooth, and she's going to be speaking on democracy as you see, false hope or false God.
First of all, of course, I'd like to thank you all for coming. So the research that I'm going to present today is based on what I did for my PhD. I spent 4 years writing my PhD, and I've kind of spent a few years since collecting facts off and on when I have the time. And I think what's a bit different about this research compared to most PhDs is that it's very, very empirical. So I try to concentrate a lot on facts. I think in academia, a lot of the time, we can be guilty of making these beautiful, logical castles in the air. What I'm doing is trying more to put in a good foundation. Someone once asked me at a presentation, could I not have done this all theoretically instead of using facts? And I have to say, I suppose I could. Many people have gone into the subject of democracy theoretically. I would prefer to stick to facts and to try to take perhaps small steps, but ones that I feel hopefully have a better basis. So, given as this is 6 years of research, we're kind of going to skim through it pretty quickly and sort of hit the high notes. Strangely, it's brought me a little bit closer to dictatorship in that I have to say, I kind of understand for the first time the appeal of being able to give a 6-hour speech while your audience has to listen to it. I feel I can finally get done what I have to say. But today we'll stick with 40 minutes, and I assume you're all grateful to hear that now. So what got me interested? First, we'll talk a little bit about the democratic deficit as it's usually spoken about in academia, a little bit about exporting democracy, but then we'll get into what I think is the most important part of democracy, and that is, what are we trying to get out of it? So there are many things we could be trying to get out of it, and today I'm going to concentrate on 3 of them, which are representation, meaning accurate representation, participation, and self-determination, and equality. So we're going to fly over those things and discuss how well the system we currently use in Western societies, which is electoral representation system, delivers on those goods, and whether and how it could possibly be improved. So hopefully I get this mouse going the right way. The first, I kind of started out, as most people do, just trying to get an overview of the issue, and I kept coming across, there's a lot on democracy, and people will tell you that's a very broad subject, and there is a lot, but it tends to be much of the same thing. The first quote I have up here is from a from a Princeton professor of politics. The second one is from an Australian professor of law. And what they say is, if you look at these, they basically talk about how, yes, there is a democratic deficit. Everyone acknowledges there's a democratic deficit, especially on an international level, a severe one. And they'll often say, for example, we really should be comparing our international structures to those in advanced industrial democracies rather than in ideal plebiscitary or parliamentary democracy. In the first quote, we see in the second quote, the author saying that they're going to investigate the World Trade Organization and they're going to compare whether or not the democratic deficiencies in the World Trade Organization are any worse than in other international organizations. So what we have in these quotes, what I noticed about these quotes, is they didn't help me much in trying to get a handle on how I could define democracy, because they always reference it to the system we currently have. So we end up going in a bit of a circle. We say, what's democracy? Democracy is what we have. And in the case of the first quote, really explicitly saying, and you will get this a lot, we shouldn't be comparing this to an ideal. We should just be comparing it to basically what we have, what's existing in advanced industrial economies. So it's very hard for us to measure its success in delivering goods without a concrete kind of arbitrary or idealized yardstick. It doesn't matter to me particularly what that yardstick is. I just think that it should exist so we can stop going around in circles when we try to define democracy. I think this is particularly important to those of us who are active in international law, as we tend to be in the business not only of living in our Western democratic representative electoral democracies, but in trying to make other countries into electoral democracies as well as we can. And that doesn't always pan out very well. Sometimes it does, sometimes it doesn't. It's often a bit of a struggle. These are a couple of quotes, as I say, you can get dozens of these, I just arbitrarily picked these, regarding democracy in Afghanistan. One's from 4 years ago, one's from quite recently, a couple of weeks ago. What you get out of them is that the picture for implementing an electoral democracy in Afghanistan is perhaps not very pretty. The second quote is from an Afghani newspaper, which says, well, we shouldn't call it quite a sinking ship. It's not always a good sign when that's what you're trying to, when you're saying, well, it's not completely hopeless, we shouldn't characterize this as a sinking ship. And the first quote, again, from a professor in the United States, basically saying we should give up on it all, let tribal chiefs rule. So, not the most inspiring situation to be in. And it's not that I'm against trying to implement democracy in other nations. I just feel that perhaps we should concentrate more on what goods we actually hope to achieve and on what we try to deliver instead of getting hung up on implementing a certain system which may or may not really achieve those goals. So, but going, okay, it could be a struggle. Afghanistan looks like a struggle in any case. But the issue is what we're doing really going to achieve what we've promised, or is it perhaps not going to achieve that? I think it's important that we examine that before we commit ourselves wholly to implementing a certain system. So, as I say, 3 promises of democracy that I will deal with today are representation, participation, and equality. So, we'll take representation first. Representation basically means that the entire population should be represented in Parliament, the Senate, what have you, an electoral body that would decide matters more or less in the same fashion that the entire population would decide them in if they were put before that decision. Therefore, it's not necessary for us all to convene on every single issue. We send a representative, and they make that choice, and it reflects how we feel about that issue. That's the idea. So I thought actually that this part would be quite unproblematic. I really thought I'd probably be done this in about 5 minutes. And I don't know even how much time I spent looking at statistics regarding electoral outcomes, but it was more than 5 minutes. What I discovered is that, and this is quite well known to those who study political science and to mathematicians, that most electoral systems actually give us what are called manufactured majorities. And a manufactured majority exists when either the governing party received the relative majority of votes in an election, so they got the relative majority of the popular vote, but they managed to translate that into an absolute majority of seats in Parliament. So you could have a party that received 40% of the popular vote, but they actually managed to, because of the way the system is set up, and because we vote for candidates in ridings, that actually translated into, let's say, 55 or 60% of seats in Parliament. So it could happen that the minority actually voted for a certain party, but they become the governing party of a nation for, 3, 4, 5 years, however long it is. The other situation is a little bit more concerning. That happens when the opposition party actually won the majority or the relative majority of votes. So you could have, for example, Party A receiving, let's say, 45% of the popular vote and Party B receiving 48% of the popular vote. But because of the way we vote in electoral ridings, Party, I think A I said, would actually become the government, because by virtue of having won more seats in Parliament. And to give an example of this, there's many examples, so I actually probably have about 25 pages of examples. It happens quite often. But one example, particularly interesting, is the federal election in Canada in 1988. And in this election, one party, the Progressive Conservative Party, got 43% of the popular vote. So far, so good. And they had 2 main rivals, the Liberal Party, which received nearly 32% of the vote, and the NDP, which received about 20% of the vote, of the popular vote. So combined, Liberals and NDP got 50%. and the Progressive Conservatives got 43% of the popular vote. However, the Progressive Conservatives won 57% of all available seats in Parliament, so they became the governing party in Canada. And this is quite interesting. This example is quite interesting because at the time, the free trade agreement with the United States was a major election issue. And what's interesting about this example is that, according to the popular vote, most people who voted in that election voted for a party that was opposed to the free trade agreement. The Progressive Conservatives were in favor of the free trade agreement. They won 43% of the popular vote, but 57% of the seats, and went on to sign the free trade agreement with the United States. So we can see how, strangely, we ended up having a situation where our government was one that had a different platform on a major electoral issue than the platform of those parties that most Canadians actually ended up voting for. I say that's one example. In Britain, for example, in 1974, the Labour Party won only 39% of the popular vote, but they received 50% of the seats in Parliament and went on to form a government. And in the 1984 Indian election, the Indian Congress Party got 76%, over 76% of all seats in Parliament, with only 48% of the popular vote. So in that case, they actually achieved a supermajority in the Parliament, but they hadn't received even a majority of votes of the population. The same thing in the States, it happens quite a lot too. Abraham Lincoln was elected with only 39% of the popular vote. Al Gore, in the 2000 election, Al Gore received about half a percentage point more of the popular vote than George Bush did, for example. So this is an issue that's particularly common in first-past-the-post systems, but it actually exists in all electoral systems, which I went through quite faithfully. Under the single transferable vote, which we use in Ireland, manufactured majorities occur about 1/5 of the time. So 20% of the time, you could be living under a government that, at best, doesn't necessarily very accurately reflect the will of the people. And the issue with this is that we're not really getting a really clear idea of what most people want most of the time. So I'd be the first to admit it's quite possible that these governments might do things that prove popular. It's quite possible that many of the measures that they pass do enjoy a majority support. But the problem is that our system doesn't really give us a whole lot of clarity on that point. In addition to that, a further thing to consider is that because some systems don't produce manufactured majorities very often, they all do, some of them don't produce them very often, a further thing to consider with our electoral system is that it tends to be dominated by certain professions. Again, this is something that's fairly well known, especially in political science circles. In Canada, in 2009, 48 out of 392 seats were held by lawyers, for example, and 30 by business managers. And in the UK, in 2005, 72 out of 561 seats, barristers or solicitors, 44% by professors or lecturers, and 33% of MPs had actually attended a fee-paying school as children, whereas the national average is 8% of children attending fee-paying schools, and 75% of MPs had a university degree, with 25% of them having a degree from just 2 universities, Oxford or Cambridge. So the average of UK citizens who have a degree from Oxford and Cambridge is not 25%. So what we have is we see not only are our legislatures skewed and the government skewed in the sense that they may not have received the majority of the popular vote, they're skewed in the sense of the social backgrounds of the people who are in Parliament, right? When we look at Parliament, if we were to make a painting of the Parliament, we wouldn't see something that looks like a reflection of society. We'd see something mainly populated by lawyers and businessmen and professors, right? So it's questionable, I think, whether or not, given overrepresentation of certain social sectors, we can really be expecting parliaments to accurately reflect the will of the people at any given time. Even though people might try to do that, I question their ability to succeed. In addition to this, we have further issues. So even if an MP was really trying to reflect the will of their constituents, we have issues in our representative systems, such as party discipline, So when one belongs to a political party, even in countries like Germany, where officially one is supposed to only vote according to one's own free conscience, there is a party whip who will ensure that on important issues, members vote more or less in the direction that the governing figures of the party would like them to vote, or perhaps face disciplinary sanctions if they refuse to do so. So it can be rather hard to truly represent your constituents when you have all of these other things going on. A third issue, which I believe is just as harmful, is that to democracy and to trying to know what everyone actually wants, is the practice of vote trading. And that happens when Party A agrees to vote on issue X, if Party B agrees to vote on issue Y for them, right? So what's particularly difficult about this issue is that you can end up having two measures passed, neither one of which actually enjoyed majority support. So people say sometimes at that point, well, how could anything get done? To which my reply would be, if someone gave me the choice tomorrow of doing nothing or two things I don't particularly want to do, I'd also take nothing. I don't particularly see the value of getting things done when the majority of people don't agree with that thing that is to be achieved. So vote trading, which is a pretty common way to get things done, especially on an international level, often used to at least obfuscate what people want. It's possible that people would choose to back both of those measures if the choice was given before them, but we don't know. So I think the best that we can say of elections is they might not be totally off. They might not be totally off, but they don't really deliver us a key idea of what we're trying to get done as a society and what people genuinely feel on most issues. And I think that's quite a big problem for us, especially when we transfer to an international level. Internationally, we have further issues because our national skewing, the skewing we have on a national level, where we have a government that doesn't necessarily, rarely represents the direction that most citizens have voted in, we have a magnification of that skewing. And that, for example, if you have, just assuming that every country in the world had a government that had received 48% of the popular vote in the election, which is already overly optimistic. In international fora, you also generally need 1/2 of members present and voting to make a decision. The WTO functions somewhat differently. It functions nominally on consensus. The reality is a little bit different. But for example, if we take the General Assembly, where each nation has one vote, often voting occurs on a 1/2 of the members present and voting basis. So even if every country, every government there had received 48% of the popular vote, a measure could be passed with 1/2 of the representatives voting in favor. We'd be down to 24, them representing really between them maximum 24% of the Earth's population. This is already an artificially optimistic scenario. So what we see on an international level, and what I think causes people dissatisfaction when they look at the international level, is this knowledge that the skewing that we have on a national level with representatives is actually made worse by taking things to another level that's a little bit further away from people, and where potentially we have majority votes that perhaps represent only a small minority of people's wishes. Again, we simply don't know. A further factor is that, of course, the voting units on an international level have wild discrepancies on how many people they actually represent. As I said, at the General Assembly, it's one nation, one vote. However, that would mean that China has one vote and Ireland has one vote. One of the nations has 1 billion people. One of them has 4 million. So we see, again, a skewing of that. We could say 1/2 of the nations voted in favor, but they may not have represented 1/2 of the population of the world. And in fact, it would be highly unlikely for them to do so. A further issue that obfuscates decision-making on an international level and makes it hard for us to trace who exactly is agreeing to what, unless you care to really look into it, but it would be hard for someone who doesn't have a background in the area to look into it, is delegating to committees. Of course, this also happens on a national level. An example of on an international level is that nominally the UN General Assembly is responsible for budgetary issues within the UN system, and in practice it delegates that responsibility to one of its committees, the 5th Committee. So far, so good, because every state also is a member of the Fifth Committee. However, the Fifth Committee in turn delegates this task to the Advisory Committee on Administrative and Budgetary Questions, and that committee only has 16 members. So usually what happens is that the Administrative Committee makes a recommendation, that's accepted by the Fifth Committee and passed on to the General Assembly. But what you have really then is a case of 16 states, representatives from 16 states making those decisions, instead of each state actually engaging in a genuine vote on it. So, as I said before, surely representatives do hit on things that are extremely popular. Surely they do things that turn out to be for the benefit of everyone. But the truth is that we don't have very little clarity of exactly who is agreeing to what. If you specialize in international law and you care to look into things, you can, of course, trace that back and figure out who exactly agreed to what. But it's quite difficult for your average person who's working a full-time job to have the leisure to come anywhere near to trying to figure those things out. So this is where most academic articles generally stop and say, yes, we've got a great big problem on our hands, and it's pretty sad. Okay, and this is the end of the article. When I was a teenager in Canada, you probably know this, we had a show called The Red Green Show, and one of the main characters' catchphrases on it was that if women don't find you handsome, they should at least find you handy. So trying to be a bit practical and go on and try to come up with some way of perhaps getting over this impasse that we're in. Probably the biggest, the most common solution, as it were, that's proffered are NGOs, now commonly termed civil society. In my day, they were called NGOs. And they say, well, people can participate, people can join NGOs, they can participate that way, that kind of counteracts state power, they do a lot of good work, you know. And so, yeah, they do, some of them do a lot of good work, some of them do quite atrocious things. But the problem with NGOs, non-governmental organizations, is that there's also no real hard measure of their popular support. Many of them are also AstroTurf organizations. That's something that you run into. AstroTurf organizations are NGOs that have been set up by public relations companies, often with corporate backing, in order to campaign on a certain issue. That doesn't mean that they don't have genuine members at times, but the level of support that they actually enjoy can be difficult to estimate, given that they're often backed in a somewhat artificial manner and don't represent true grassroots involvement in that sense. Also, many NGOs are financed by governments. And as I said, even for the ones that aren't, we don't have a really solid measure of how much support they actually do enjoy. So they do a lot of good work, and they do a lot of work in counterbalancing, in many ways, the power of states, but they don't really solve our clarity problem. We still don't know what most people want about most issues. We're kind of hoping that if we throw two things at each other, they'll sort of balance each other out, instead of trying to get to grips with how we could measure, perhaps, popular support in a more accurate manner. So, decided to try to think outside of the box a little bit further. Ended up thinking very far indeed outside of the box. This was actually at the behest of my late doctor father. He said, why don't you go back and look at what democracy was in Athens? And I thought, oh no, I really don't want to do this. First of all, it's a pretty common thought when your supervisor tells you something. First of all, I'm going to have to go hang out in the classics section of the library. People will think I'm a complete dork, for one thing. Probably be thinking I'm watching Star Trek or something in my spare time. And the second, I just didn't really see what it was going to yield. Because like most people, I would have thought, okay, there is democracy, yada yada, in Athens. That was ages ago. And eventually we developed what we have out of that, right? So, whatever. It's ancient history, literally. But I began to look into it. I mean, he told me to look into it, so I duly sent myself off to the classics section and began to read about this topic. And I think I ended up being in the classics section for about 2 years. And this was because the Athenian political system wasn't very much like ours at all. And it made it kind of difficult to understand at first. But I eventually worked myself into it. Probably the most interesting thing about the Athenian system is that it was, at one point in time, in electoral democracy, if you want. They had all those years ago, a 600-member legislative assembly and did things much like we do them today. And then after that, they decided they would implement democracy. So in ancient documents, that period of history where they had the legislative assembly that was elected by most Athenian citizens, they never used the term democracy to refer to that. They use the term democracy to refer to what they did next. And what they did next was they basically evolved a very simple system, really. In some ways it was complex, but in some ways it was very simple. And they had two main bodies, if you will. The first one was the assembly, or ecclesia, and the second were the courts. And these were bodies of collective decision-making. So the assembly took all substantial decisions, and anyone who was an adult male citizen was automatically a member of this assembly, and you came and went as you felt like it. You were supposed to attend, but no one could force you. So assembly attendance would be about 5,000 or 6,000 people. They couldn't seat more than 6,000 people in the enclosure that they were using for that purpose, and that would have been out of a total population of about between 35 and 50,000 citizens, right? This form of government, by the way, went on for about 140 years. So sometimes when I'm saying things that comes from a certain period of that history, the way they practiced democracy shifted a little bit over that period of time. But the strange thing is that, yes, the assembly basically just took all decisions. They'd never delegated decision-making. That's probably the most important thing to come out of this. Even in times of war, they would not delegate decision-making to any officials. And a historian once compared this to as if Winston Churchill during World War II had to go back and get a referendum on every move he made. If you read the records that have survived, that's exactly what it was like, actually. So a very, let's just say, participative process. We'll get to that later, but for now, I'm just trying to give an overview of the main organs, if you will. The courts, also very important, and also really a body of collective decision-making in Athens. All courts were jury courts, so this is something that's kind of survived to this time a little bit. However, in Athens, jury courts were a minimum of 201 jurors sat on a court. That was for small civil matters, and that could range up to a maximum of 6,000 jurors for important matters, usually constitutional matters. So you're talking between 200 and 6,000 people in the court. And these jurors, much like whoever happened to show up to assembly, were selected completely randomly. Probably won't have time to get into how they did that today. It was very, very clever and quite efficient, but they were all selected randomly on that day. The judge was also an official who was selected randomly on that day, and that was all very much on purpose. And the Athenians would sometimes extol how random that in fact was and how the judge knew nothing about the case. This was viewed as a very good thing and a laudable state of affairs. So, as you might be guessing, there is a certain element of randomness in the Athenian system. And they did that, as I'm saying, they did that very consciously and on purpose to prevent power concentrations from forming in their society. The officials, such as they were also randomly selected by lottery. Again, they actually used something, I'll get into it if I have time, but actually they used something like an ancient lotto machine to do this. It's actually quite sophisticated, this little stone machine they had, and it wasn't much different than you would see on the National Lottery at night on TV. So they actually would use this to choose officials, and it wasn't so harmful. People often think at this point, oh my gosh, are you joking? They just chose officials by randomly. That must have been a disaster, which is, the line of thinking most people go down when studying Athens. However, officials, because all substantial decisions were made collectively in the assembly and the courts, there wasn't a whole lot left for the officials to do. The officials generally were tasked with carrying out the decisions of the people. They didn't have very much power, right? Most officials were in charge of really glamorous things, like keeping the streets clean, making sure proper weights and measures were used, collecting fines, that kind of thing, the daily work, if you want, of the city. So it wasn't at all glamorous, and it was really quite routine for most of their tasks. They were delegated executing tasks, but they weren't delegated decision-making. So you see, all decision-making always resided in the people. an official very rarely got to make a decision. The only exceptions were generals, who were actually elected, and treasurers, who were elected. There were a few more minor exceptions, but those were the main ones. So the Athenians knew all about elections because they'd been using elections beforehand. And they decided to maintain those for what they viewed as the most important tasks of the city, which were defending it, perhaps conquering new territory, as and when the opportunity arose, and keeping track of the accounts. So for those areas, there were elected officials. Interestingly enough, although the majority of these officials had virtually no power, they were constantly scrutinized by the people in assembly, and they were subject to three processes, which I won't go into in much detail: documentia, oithanoi, and impeachment. Documentia was scrutinizing the officials' life before they took office. So we kind of have that today, for example, in the United States, before people take up a post with the administration. Oithanoi referred to checking over everything that had happened when they relinquished office after 1 year. Interestingly enough, these were people who forced even those officials who never handled money to give a full statement of their accounts when they laid down their office, and impeachment. And that meant that at every main assembly, there were 40 assembly meetings per year, 4 per month, because there were only 10 months back then. One of those meetings was the main assembly, so 1 per month. And at every main assembly, the question would be asked, have the officials done anything wrong? And that was your chance to get up and make a complaint. So most people would characterize us, and in Athens has been characterized as a direct democracy. People say, that's a direct democracy. That's an example of a direct democracy. I would differ on that point and say it's actually an example of a representative democracy, because most Athenians were not involved in any one decision. If you take the courts ranging from 201 to 6,000 Athenians, that means that at any one time, maybe 2% to 15% of the population was involved in a decision making, in a certain decision. So, in the sense, everyone else was kind of represented by those Athenians. It wasn't true that they tracked down every last person and made them participate in every single decision. So it was more representative. But the thing that comes out of it for me is that it was probably more accurately representative, in that you could choose to come up if you wanted to participate in a decision. So there was a certain sense of self-sorting. People who weren't interested didn't need to come along. People who weren't interested didn't need to report themselves to jury duty. And because we don't have permanent power, or I should say semi-permanent forms of power, in that one party would become the governing party, another party would be opposition, there was more opportunity to vote a la carte on what you wanted and what you particularly as a person agreed with. So I believe that would give them as a society perhaps a more accurate idea of what the majority actually wanted. In addition, there was a larger cross-section in any given decision-making body. This election was random. It wasn't the case that there would be 1 in 4 people who had a particularly terrific education, or 1 in 8 of them, as we've seen in Canada, who would be barristers or solicitors. It would be a more random cross-section, and that's borne out by the many complaints of those who didn't like democracy, basically complaining about the fact that the assembly was full of tradespeople. An additional advantage to this form of democracy is that it was very, very efficient. So in a national democracy, as we have it today, we spend a lot of time and energy trying to get control of the situation. And on an international level, we can spend even more time and energy trying to get control of a situation. In this system, because you don't need to have very many elections, and because you don't need to fight for control all of the time, you can afford to spend a bit more time focusing on actual policy, which they did with great abandon. So, unfortunately, as I said, I can't wait till the day I can give a 6-hour speech. We won't get through all of this. I'll fly over it very quickly. Participation, very, very quickly. Participation and self-determination and equality. Our participation rates, it's no secret, in national democracies are quite low. And what I think is it's not just a matter for me of, only a very few people sign a petition, hardly anyone shows up to talk to their MP, things like that. We have to consider that we have a very passive forms of participation. We often ask for other people to make a decision. Even when you go out and protest on the street, essentially what you're doing is trying to force someone else to make a decision and to decide in the way you would like them to decide. But you're not involved in making a decision yourself most of the time, unless you are a politician. So it's generally speaking quite passive. On an international level, there's very little in the way of individual participation. It's almost all state or NGO mediated. By now I had an idea of a society where things were wildly different that I could compare this to. The difference for a system such as the one that existed in Athens for 140 years and has existed in a few other societies for varying periods of time is that citizens participated constantly. Something like 1/7 of them came to assembly every time it convened. Something like every person had to sit on a jury 1 out of every 7 days, just in order to make up the numbers. So there was a lot of participation, but I think more important than that, it was the quality of participation, because it was participation in a decision-making capacity. When one went to assembly, one could pick topics that should be talked about. One also had the right to address the assembly, and in the assembly there would be a genuine debate on what happened. I should point out at this point, I don't have time to go into it, it's still privileged wealthy people, to be honest, but the average person, those wealthy people, were not those that got to make the decisions. The decisions were made by the people, as it were, acting collectively. And so I think that is also something we should be concerned about in our societies, not just the numbers of participation, but actually the quality of participation. I know for myself, I'd be much more happier to participate in a decision-making capacity than to, do petitions or whatever that someone's probably going to ignore. So the third issue is equality. Democracy delivers equality. Unfortunately, and I have many, many statistics back this up, in an electoral system, power ultimately can be translated into wealth, and wealth can be translated into power, and power can be translated into more wealth, and wealth can be translated into more power. And the reason for that is that we say talk is cheap, but gathering people to hear your talk is not cheap. It's very expensive. And to win an election, you need quite a lot of money. Regulation helps to some extent, but it's a constant battle. I looked at a lot of different countries, and I found in all of the ones that I looked at, and this ranged from American presidential elections to local elections in Ireland, which I thought were about as parochial as you could possibly get. Actually, money has a measurable influence on the outcome of elections to a quite staggering extent. Basically, the more you spend, better your chances of winning, and if you spend enough, you can be virtually sure of it. Never quite sure. There's always a chance. But to say that the exception proves the rule is, to be honest, a statement I never quite got. So we actually have a systemic case of money basically being used to buy elections. We don't really say that, but that's what it does. There's exceptions. But the question is whether we want to live under a system that throws up the occasional exception, or one that perhaps is a little bit more egalitarian. So the problem we have is that electoral democracy, unfortunately, exacerbates wealth discrepancies, ultimately. On an international level, this is all the more so. On an international level, vote buying is actually quite normal. So in international organizations, this is the example I have on the board is the example of Resolution 678 on Iraq in, I think, 1991. That's the most famous example, but there's tons like them. It's quite normal to buy the votes of smaller countries in trying to get the issue you'd like to see done, essentially. It's almost impossible to get something done without buying other votes, even when it should be done. So, as I say, I don't have much time to go into it, but because in Athens everyone was chosen randomly, it was very difficult to translate wealth into power because it was a very unforeseeable process. And that's why the Athenians chose it, essentially. As I say, they had elections. They knew very well about elections. In the Roman Republic, which wasn't too far away, they did have elections. They knew very well what they were talking about. And because they used their sort of lottery method that was nearly impossible to rig, they basically broke, to a large extent, not completely, but significantly made a dent in the sort of cycle between wealth and power. And therefore were able to have some greater level of equality in their society, some greater level of political equality in their society than we would see today. So I think that's all we have time for before question time.
Thank you very much for that. If I can start, I have, in a sense, maybe questions more generally that go beyond in the scope, and that typically in international law we think of states as unitary actors, so we don't make, typically international law makes no determination as to whether a state is democratic or not. How does, so maybe two questions. The first is that how does democracy then interact in international law from your perspective?
Yeah, this is how things always begin. I could see you scribbling away there furiously, and it was kind of making me anxious while I was talking. Yeah, I think that's actually something I had to deal with fairly early on in my research, because I did think to myself, okay, yes, what does this have to do with international law? But what motivated me to pick up this research to begin with is that, as I'm sure everyone is aware, the issue of international non-accountability, as it were, has become greater and greater in recent years, because we have a higher level of globalization and integration on an international level. And I believe that people are more aware now than they would have been 20 or 30 years ago as to how those international processes affect their lives. So traditionally, yes, we have said, okay, it's state to state. We're not going to look into how it functions. International law has nothing to do with that. I think if we want to move in a direction, I think we're always moving in history. We're never staying still. So I think if we want to move into a situation where people have a greater say over their own lives, that's going to have to involve the international level at this point, because there's many areas of law, such as taxation, for example, that now international corporate taxation, that can really only be solved on an international level at this point. And the question is, where will those mechanisms be autocratic and, maybe I shouldn't maybe say authoritarian, but kind of semi-authoritarian or paternalistic, or will they be democratic? And if they're going to be democratic, I didn't say they're going to be, if they're going to be democratic, how could we make that happen? Because it does look like a very difficult task on the face of it. And I think actually the conclusion that I came to myself, and this is why I spent so much time dealing with domestic issues as well, is that I do think that the best way would be probably to increase democratic decision-making on a national level, because it would at least reduce the number of filters that decision-making process has to go through before it hits the international level. Perhaps we still would send representatives to an international level, but if they were more reflective of the majority's will on a particular issue, first of all, we'd have less distortion in what happens, and we'd be able to keep better accountability of what happens. At the moment, representatives go off to international conferences, and we've got a pretty opaque view of what happens there, unless you go through and read the minutes of the conference, which sometimes are available, sometimes aren't, and it's a fairly arduous process. So I think the international and national planes are really tied closely together on this one. I don't think you can really separate them.
Can you just talk about the empirical element of your study, because I didn't really see it fleshed out, but for this interesting issue about your comments on Iraq and UN Security Council 678.
Yeah.
How do you go about documenting things that are, in essence, in that case, not necessarily within the public purview? So there are deals that are made. How do you go about trying to identify and checking the sources, et cetera, making sure that you have valid data? It
took a very long time. The short answer is really, really slowly and really, really arduously. I say it took me 4 years, but I really put a lot of hours into this. With Resolution 678, yes, that one's, as I'm sure we all know, a quite well-known example, right? Because what happened in that particular case is that the United States wanted to go to Iraq had invaded Kuwait, and the US and most states really wanted to go in and force Iraq out of Kuwait again. And from a Security Council, from a UN point of view, it was a fairly straightforward case. This is exactly what the UN was set up to do. However, the United States found that other nations were not willing to go along with that without getting a bit of a kickback, and so they began making certain payments. I have them all documented here. And what I did, actually, is I went back and traced them all to see if they actually happened, really. So I traced every one of them down, just to make sure that actually that had been carried out. For example, the United States convinced Saudi Arabia and Kuwait to give some loans to Russia, which they really badly needed. I just went over newspapers of the time until I found a record of those loans actually being delivered to the USSR, which is it's actually there. A lot of stuff is there if you put in the time to look for it. That would be an example. I also made sure I looked through the records of the World Bank to make sure that the loan promise to China went through at that point, and I made sure that the Baltic states, for example, didn't go to the Paris summit. You know, things like that. I just started thinking, how could I figure this out? And I went and tracked it down until I found all of them. The reason this statement this resolution is so famous is because allegedly Yemen did vote against the resolution, and allegedly, the representative of the United States stalked over to the Yemeni delegate at that point and said to them, that is the most expensive vote your country has ever cast, which was caught, so the story goes, caught on the microphone of the Yemeni delegate, which was still on, and blasted all over the Security Council chamber. So, and not only that, they very much delivered on that. So they cut off, the U.S. cut off 70 million in aid to Yemen. Again, I checked that out. They did, in fact, cut off that aid. And hundreds of thousands of Yemeni workers literally were expelled from Saudi Arabia at that point. So I went and checked to make sure that all actually really happened. I mean, the original was already quoted from, actually it was quoted from, I believe, a Canadian delegate to the United Nations at that time. It was included in one of his academic articles, so I already had sort of a eyewitness to the case reporting on it, but I went down and double-checked it all myself.
Somewhat of a comment, somewhat of a question. This is not on the slides, and a bit my area, I'll point out. You were saying that you were looking for practical forces and that you wanted to see whether it's possible to make the approach at the national level more democratic in order to then bring it to the international level. And from what I'm gathering, you're not particularly a big fan of the current representative approaches. Do you really think, though, that the Athenian approach is one that is practical? That you may have the ideal there, but the UK, when they were bringing in the sovereignty clause for the EU law, and they were bringing in the possibility of having all these referenda, there's a lot of academic debate on the idea that this will just cause so many issues and that they'll try and cut back on having them.
Yeah, one thing that's probably worth mentioning is that referenda are bought and sold in much the same way that elections are. So financial influence in referenda, and this also includes the referenda we've had in Ireland, is actually quite extreme. If you have referenda occasionally, then they certainly become a focal point for the both sides who are lobbying on that. What I would say, what I was basically trying to do is look for societies where democracy had existed. Athens would be one of them. The early United States was actually also quite similar in its arrangement. Actually, most tribal societies work on what we would call democratic grounds all the time, right? When modern nation states basically ditched monarchy, the first examples being the United States and France, at that point, there was a public discussion on whether or not they should institute a democracy or what they called a republic, which was based upon Roman lines. And one of the key reasons that they decided to institute a republic was that, they were talking a large territory with millions of people. And how could you make something like this happen in that situation, right? At the time, it was a good idea. And at the time, if you took having a large territory with hundreds of thousands or millions of citizens at a given, it was really the best solution. However, I would think what you could do now, it's just an idea, I think with the internet, and already you have parties that are agitating for this. For example, in Germany, the Pirate Party has a certain level of support. I don't think having votes on a large number of issues would be completely infeasible. I mean, they already use internet voting and even telephone voting in Estonia, for example. So I think it would be feasible. I think I didn't get to address some of the concerns with democracy today. If I said a 6-hour speech, maybe an 8-hour speech. But there certainly is like a dark side to this. There were problems. One issue, which I think is a key issue, is that Athens and the early United States, in the way the society was organized, were very homogenous societies. There wasn't a whole lot, there weren't many divisive disagreements. They agreed on a lot of issues from the outset. As I might have said, I refer to citizens. Citizens, of course, means ethnic Athenian adult males. No one else. So there's certainly, I think there are issues about implementing democracy. I think that because we have issues with oligarchy that tend to increase, we have to start thinking very hard about what those issues really are. It's probably no longer the technical feasibility of it. I think that was, until not too long ago, a major issue and a major stumbling block. I think now we should probably turn our attention to issues, let's just say darker issues that kind of erupt, such as how would this work in a very heterogeneous society? And of course, one thing that was quite common in Athens, bribery was virtually non-existent because it was very hard to have enough money to bribe so many citizens. However, blackmail was a pretty common thing. So, like, if you study the system, you kind of start to notice, okay, those are the problems that kind of erupt in it. So I just think that instead of accepting a system as is, especially when that's starting to run into problems, we should start thinking about how we could really deal with those problems to deliver the goods we're promising to ourselves, as it were, in a better fashion.
Then please join me in thanking Dr. Fuller for this presentation on democracy. Thank you very much.